Hi everyone, it's Bobby here. I just want to take a few minutes to touch base with you here after Learning Plan 5. So we obviously had two discussion boards. The primary one was dealing with mental health and picking a diagnosis in regards to mental health, one that primarily affects children and how it looks different between children and adults. I think you all did a really, really good job with that. Several of you picked borderline personality disorder. Certainly a more challenging personality disorder to work with, but many of the clients that I've had that have had borderline personality disorder have been really amazing to work with. So just want to kind of say that a little bit. The other thing I just want to touch base on, obviously, is Tanya. You guys all did a really good job kind of incorporating the things that we've learned throughout this learning plan. The one thing I did want to touch base on, I was just finishing grading and I noticed there was a discussion based on whether or not to give out personal information to clients. Don't ever give out your personal address, your telephone number, those kinds of things to clients. When we talk about ethics and boundaries, those are some things that we want to make sure that we keep separate. Not only because of safety issues, but also just because it's just what's appropriate. So setting up boundaries of your work hours, things like that. And when there are crisis situations, it's setting up something for your clients to deal with when they're in a crisis, like the crisis line, things like that. It doesn't necessarily have to be you. So just wanted to kind of touch base on that. There was also a discussion between ADHD and ODD and the differences between the two of them, keeping in mind that ODD is a relatively new diagnosis and ADD or ADHD is a diagnosis that we've been seeing for quite some time. Obviously, there's an argument sometimes with ODD. Is it really a true diagnosis, or is it just kind of a scapegoat for kids who are rebellious or delinquent? Um, and things like that, and the need to label kids. I'm not so sure that we have that debate decided yet, but I think is recognizing that ODD is basically a diagnosis of, characteristics that we see in kids who struggle with um, following the rules, maintaining order, things like that, and we start to see those patterns of behaviors early on when we look at the environment of risk and protective factors and we outline this really good in person, but when we look at sort of the things that put us at risk for delinquency is if we grow up in a home or an environment where there isn't really a regard to the law. And we see this in permissive parenting, where there really isn't respect, there really isn't order, there really isn't things like that that are in the home. So some of those things those kiddos have been exposed to early on, and those are really huge risk factors, obviously, for ODD. There are probably some chemical imbalances as well. Um, and also just talking about some of the things that are part of mental health diagnoses. But recognizing that ODD is pretty relevant, especially when you're working in delinquency. I definitely saw a lot of diagnoses of that. But I think we have to be careful that that diagnosis isn't thrown around. And I do think when we are starting to learn more about ADD and ADHD that it isn't necessarily always medication. It can just be some modification of behaviors, even changes in diet and things like that to look at. Oftentimes they're misdiagnosed. ADD is diagnosed as ODD and vice versa. So just kind of keeping that in mind as well. Recognizing that kids are still developing and the human brain is actually still developing until about 25. Some of these diagnoses are really easy to just throw around. Um, I'm pretty squeamish about diagnosing any kids just because I feel like they've got a lot of time to respond to their environment and kind of what's going on. So with that being said, everything has been graded thus far. So make sure that you're checking in on your grades, you're touching base with me if things don't look right or things are confusing. In that regard. The other thing too I want to touch base on is we're jumping into Learning Plan 6. We're about a week in, so you should be doing two discussion boards. One is evidence-based practice based on an agency that's local to you. So if you're in Green Bay, it's somewhere in Green Bay. If you're in Wausau, somewhere in Wausau, things like that. And you're telling us about the agency, and it's not just copying and pasting off the website. Preferably, I would hope that you would call the agency and get information on your own. If you do, make sure that you cite that. Definitely there's going to be a grade difference for those who choose to just copy and paste off a website. So just keeping that in mind. The other thing I want to touch base on is the second discussion board is using the website found in Learning Plan 6. There's a huge list of evidence-based programs that I want you to take some time to read through. Find one that piques your interest and then share it with a class. And when you share it with a class, tell us, how the program works, why it's evidence-based, all those sorts of things. The biggest thing I want you guys to understand about this learning plan is there's a difference between an intervention that's put in kind of willy-nilly, and there's a difference between something that's evidence-based. So something that we know works, something that we know has proven results, and something that is done consistently across the board. So for example, when I was a social worker in Washington County, I ran the juvenile supervision program. So we actually called it intensive supervision. And it was mandated by state statute that it's run in a certain way. And it was evidence-based, meaning that the youth had to have face-to-face contact with a social worker every single day, sometimes multiple times a day, face-to-face, phone contacts. There needed to be immediate consequences like sanctions, so placing the kids in handcuffs, putting them in corrections if they violated the terms of their supervision, and there needed to be an incorporation of cognitive behavioral therapy. There needed to be all these other things that made it evidence-based, because if we were just going to work with kids in Washington County and it works here, but then we're trying to run intensive supervision in Marathon County, it needs to look the same. So a program isn't evidence-based if we're not keeping it consistent. So that's the thing I want you guys to keep in mind as we're working through Learning Plan 6 is it's one thing to put an intervention in place that you feel like, oh, this might work, and it's one thing to put an intervention in place that you know is going to work based on evidence and research. So you're going to see the two different things between promising practice and evidence-based practice. Promising practice means it's starting to show some increased significance, it's starting to show a decrease in risk factors, things like that. And we're going to keep researching it, but it's promising. And those are okay to present on too, because we have to start somewhere, right? We have to start looking at things, but this is going to show you that things have to be measured. And when we're looking at funding, it's absolutely critical that we look at things that can be measured. So when Jeff and I started the Marathon County Sexual Offenders Program, where we were working with juveniles that were in and out of residential, we had to make sure that the interventions we were putting in place, like group therapy, individual therapy, intensive in-home, all those things, that they were evidence-based. And so we had to do a level of risk assessment first to determine what risk factors we were looking at, and then continue to evaluate the students, excuse me, the clients as we were working through this to determine that their level of risk was going down. So I hope that makes sense to you guys. I'll be checking in throughout the week to make sure things are going good, and then we're going to jump into Learning Plan 7. Again, I want to just give a little bit of a notice. Learning Plan 7 is abuse and neglect, so it's really intense emotionally, and it's very triggering, especially for kids and moms and dads and anybody else really who you know, struggles with this topic. So just kind of keeping that in mind as we work through it. So I'm here if you need anything at all. I hope you have a great rest of the week.